I'm Sarah Williamson, and this is Going Long with FCLT Global. On this show, you'll learn what it means to be long-term from the top minds in global business and investing. Leaders from companies and investment organizations join us to discuss how they are leading their teams for the long run on issues including capital allocation, risk management, climate change, and sustainability. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org.
Today, our guest is Heather McGregor. Professor Heather McGregor is the Executive Dean of the Edinburgh Business School, which is the School of Business of Heriot-Watt University. And previously, she was an entrepreneur and investment banker. So Heather, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sarah, it's lovely to be here with you today.
And let's start with, I know that in addition to your academic and business career, you wrote for many years under the pseudonym of Mrs. Moneypenny in the Financial Times. So you're an astute observer of markets. Maybe we'll start there. How are you seeing these markets that that are reacting to COVID, but doing it in interesting ways? Can you give us your perspective?
Yes, I started writing the Mrs. Moneypenny column in 1999, can you believe it? When markets look very different to how they are now. But I was living and working at the time in Tokyo, and I used to start the column every week with where the Nikkei was. And so I was really following markets really closely for years. And at the time I was working in an investment bank. So you never get away from that. You know, whatever you do in life, if you have been someone who's always followed the markets, I think you always will do. And I really have been struck by what has happened in COVID. And I'm particularly struck by this because, you know, I sit on the board, as you know, of a number of public companies and indeed a private equity-backed company. And I'm shortly going to join the company join the board, I expect, of an investment trust. So it's really quite a broad, different viewpoint, if you like, of markets. But one of the things that all of these companies have in common is they've all accessed the debt capital markets. And I have been very, very noticing, if you like, of how buoyant those markets have been. So where is this wall of money coming from that is fueling the debt capital markets? Now, there's no doubt, of course, that governments need to spend to get through this pandemic. And also, we know that there's a lot of money looking for a home because the people who have that money, can't spend it on traveling or whatever they would normally spend it on. So eating out, this kind of thing. I mean, I think the whole pandemic has developed a new whole generation of accidental savers. So there is a liquidity. There's no shortage of liquidity out there. But it really did strike me also last year that there was next to no equity raising. And what 21 has seen is two really big bouts of equity raising. I mean, the first is around the Chinese issuance and Asian issuance generally. We've seen a lot of issuance from Asia, not just the famous delayed Alibaba equity issue, but plenty of other issues as well. And then we've also seen the SPAC movement, which is particularly prevalent in the US at the moment, but I'm absolutely sure is coming to Europe. And then when you look back at some of the analysis of last year, I mean, I'm a great believer in you have to study history, otherwise it repeats itself. And last year was an extraordinary year for two reasons. Number one, the number of types of startup companies. So when you do an analysis of startup companies in the UK, the number one type of company that started up last year in the UK was disinfectant companies. That's not a surprise, is it? There's a whole COVID economy out there. But the other thing is ESG funds. And I think last year, when we look back in history now, last year will be seen as the year where ESG funds finally went mainstream.
And as you think about those ESG funds going mainstream, obviously Europe has been ahead in a lot of ways than the US, but it seems to be pretty much a global phenomenon. Do you think that's a COVID-induced response to what people are seeing right now, and we'll go back, or do you think this is a permanent shift towards?
I think this is a permanent shift. I think this is partly, a COVID-induced response, which is, I think, the size of the amount of money entering ESG is a permanent response. But there's also a whole generational shift. I'm going to be 60 next year, and the generation that I grew up in, born in the 60s, we were the last people really to have, for instance, defined benefit pension funds. And you didn't really, your pension got invested for you more or less. You didn't usually, unless you were super keen, actually go in and change your preferences about your asset allocations. There was usually there was usually some kind of algorithm, actually, that the older you got, the more that they sold down equity and put you into fixed income. But I think the generation behind me, and especially the generation behind that, so the people who are probably 25 years younger than me, and who are now 35-ish, they are being very proactive about where they want their money. I think that's these generations are very purpose led. And I think that's great. But what it does mean is that they are much more vocal about where they want their long-term savings to be invested. That won't go away after COVID.
Right. No, that won't go away. And I think this accidental saver point you made is really interesting as well, because of course, what we've seen up to COVID is essentially declining saving rates, at least in the most developed economies. And as you pointed out, a dissipation of defined benefit and other sorts of pension plans. So do you think we're going to turn the corner on people realizing it's actually pretty useful to save, or are we going to go back to eating out and traveling as soon as we get the opportunity?
Well, I don't know about you, Sarah, but as soon as I get the opportunity, I'm both eating out and traveling. That said, again, I think this has been a permanent hinge moment. So I think a lot of companies will look at their carbon footprint and their travel expenditure and start to say, look, how realistic is this? I mean, I speak as somebody who works in a university where we are very heavily involved in, as you know, in net zero and in lots of technological based research into decarbonization. And yet, despite this, all of these academics fly all around the world to meet each other and present papers to each other. And what I have seen happen over the last year is, while they've been forced to do it online, they're starting to say, we're researching this area. How sensible is it for us to keep flying and meeting each other when we are preaching net zero? So I think that there will be now a much bigger shift to no traveling, but less traveling.
And you mentioned you serve on a number of boards. Do you think that the boards that you are on are also shifting? It's not just the investors. The boards are thinking hard about the ESG issues this year in a way that they perhaps, wouldn't have been a year ago?
Yes, I mean, whether it's for the right reasons is another matter. But you know what? If you don't measure the things that you value, you will only end up valuing the things that you measure. And so because ESG is now being measured much more strongly by the markets because it's consumer led. We saw last year this record amount of money going into ESG funds, and as I said, this is really a change in direction because it was material last year. I think I would go as far to say that, if we go back 10 years, honestly, if you were insisting on putting your money in what was then called sustainable funds, I suspect you were somebody who was also doing daily yoga and pursuing a vegan diet. But these days, everybody walking down the street, as I said, because of generational shifts, will now want to know where their money is being invested and why. And so what I'm seeing is that, for instance, companies planning an exit, so companies that maybe are not public now, are really thinking hard about this because they know that if they won't get the multiple on exit that they would like if they don't appeal to this whole, enormous number of funds that are only going to invest in you if you have got sensible ESG objectives and governance.
And you mentioned that at Heriot-Watt, you're also doing a lot of work on decarbonization and thinking about how we actually put some of these technologies, get new technologies, actually put them to work. Because one of the things with ESG, of course, is that historically, sometimes it's been divesting of things that are bad in some way. I think increasingly we're seeing it also investing in things that are good or investing in the technology of the future. So how do you see the work that you all are doing at Heriot-Watt coming together with this trend to put money behind more green funds?
Well, that's where I think at the moment there is a bit of a disconnect between what needs funding and how it needs funding and the kind of money. So people do want to put their money into ESG, absolutely. But do you think they want to put their money into things where they might not see a return for 5 years, and in fact, or 10, and in fact, they might not see a return at all? That still, I think, makes people feel uncomfortable. And even though you can explain to, somebody who's 35, the in the UK, the government retirement age is 67. So if you're 35, you've got 32 years to invest for. And I don't think, though, that people think in 32-year cycles. I think that's just still too long a time for them to contemplate. And if you look at some of the projects we're working on at Heriot-Watt, they are really things that are going to need a leap of faith. We're developing aviation fuel from food waste, for instance, as an example. We are looking at road transportation and trying to make it all electric and driverless, which means that the truck, in order to recharge itself, the truck, which in one day won't have a driver, the non-existent, the algorithm or the AI that's driving it won't nip out of the cab. And this kind of the cold chain, when you have LNG, the gas that is shipped around the world, when it has to keep things really, really cold, when it gets to where it's going, it discharges all that cold usually into the ocean. And yet, there are countries where you need to get things cold, very hot countries. So it would be much better if those ships actually transferred their cold, if you like, into places that could use it rather than just dispensing it into the ocean. So that all of these are the kinds of things we're studying at Heriot-Watt, and we are making huge progress with this. We've got the UK's net zero champion for industrial decarbonisation based at Heriot-Watt. But what we don't see is necessarily the lines of funding coming forward to invest in this. And this is despite the fact that, and this is a paper, of course, that's on your website, it has been shown, over and over again, that the longer term R&D investment is where the better returns are. So you can show people papers on that, they're blue in the face, they still feel uncomfortable about investing for a 32-year period.
Yeah, it just feels so long to most people. I mean, we're, trying to get people to focus on the long term, and we're usually trying to get them off of a quarter or a year or 3 years. So 32 years is a challenge. Historically in research, especially research where you're not sure what's going to happen, there's been this chain, if you will, from academic research to venture capital to sort of pre-IPO to a company that goes public and so on. Where are you seeing this disconnect? Is it not funding it at the academic stage? Is it not enough venture? Is it not enough sort of pre-IPO, which may be a long time in some of these cases? Is it not enough at the end? Where's the bottleneck here?
So I think that is the bottleneck is, the disconnect between the very early stage investments that are still in the lab. At that point you're investing in R&D. So I would have expected, and we do have that, some of the work that's going on in our labs is being invested in by companies with very huge foresight, and so ultimately the beneficiaries will be the investors in those companies. But some of it, in my view, should be being invested in by investors who would then actually directly, through some mediated fund, maybe, that would hold a mandate for the long term. We live, as you know, the main campus of our university is in Scotland, although we're also in Dubai and Malaysia. And Scotland is a home of many famous fund managers and fund management companies, many of whom, have invested for the long term, and inevitably this pays off. I also like to think of investing for the long term as being, buy and hold, invest your money and just don't do anything for a long time, because nothing that I've ever read shows me that portfolio churn is a very good idea. So actually, if you think about it as being minimizing portfolio churn, that is the same thing, investing for a long time. So I would like to see people having more opportunities to invest directly into R&D if they've got an element of their capital that they want to, have it, if you like, invested in the long term. I don't see that everyone's going to always put all of their money in the long term. Of course not. People are going to have different horizons and, different times of return. But what I actually think is that, if we can get people to have a different approach to maybe some of their capital, then that is what I think will unlock. And then what, of course, you also need is trusted intermediaries in the middle. So you need some fund managers to offer those funds too.
Right, who also have that long-term time frame and have the incentive based on that long-term time frame, rather than, for example, raising assets or churning the portfolio. Because as you said, churning the portfolio is usually not very good for the investor. It's often good for somebody on the other side.
Yes, churning the portfolio is almost never in the interests of anybody, actually, other than somebody else who, isn't the fund manager and isn't the investor. It's almost certainly somebody in the markets. I mean, interestingly, if we have a lot of volatility in the markets, interdealer brokers and people like this who are basically intermediaries, they're all the winners. People who make money out of risk movement are the people who are winners in volatility. Personally, I'd like to think that I would buy things and just not move from those things unless I absolutely should.
Well, you mentioned history a few minutes ago, and one of the really interesting parts of history at your school is Adam Smith. So, and his home. Can you tell us a little bit about the story of the Adam Smith house?
Of course, and I think we should also discuss how Adam Smith and focusing capital on the long term are intertwined as well, because his reach is everywhere, despite the fact that he's been dead for well over 200 years. Adam Smith, for anybody listening who isn't familiar, is the 18th century economist and moral philosopher who was born in Fife, which is a county in Scotland, just not far from Edinburgh, actually just over the water from Edinburgh. And he lived for the last 12 years of his life in Edinburgh, where he was the head of taxation at the port. So he was the head of customs and excise, effectively. And during those 12 years, he lived in a house called Panmure House. He didn't own it. He rented it. It had been built about 100 years before. And he made it absolutely his own. He revised the last few editions of The Wealth of the Nations and his other major work, The Ethereal of Moral Sentiments there. And every weekend, he would gather the greatest minds in Edinburgh at the time. And this was, of course, the time of the Enlightenment. So there were some astonishingly famous people and clever people who he knew, ranging from people in literature like Robert Burns. He was a subscriber to Burns's first ever book that he published as a subscription book in order to fund himself. And James Watt, who Adam Smith was a huge supporter of the engineer Watt, and in fact, again, purchased from him one of his early copying machines. So he was just fascinated by all these amazing minds around him. And he used to gather them together every Sunday to try and solve, if you like, intellectually at least, the biggest problem in the world, which in those days were international trade and trade barriers, and also the increasing productivity that was coming with the early Industrial Revolution.
And tell us about how you got a hold of this house, and how you found the house.
So I got my job in September 2016. I started on the 1st of September 2016. And when I was being interviewed for my role, and I came from being an entrepreneur straight into full-time academia, although I had a PhD and I'd been a visiting professor, this was a really new experience for me to become a dean and a professor from the private sector. And of course, when you go for a job interview, I'm sure like you, Sarah, the first thing you do is go and look in the accounts to see, what kind of thing you're inheriting. And when I looked at the accounts of the business school, I could see that it has a £3.5 million work in progress. I was like, what's this? And they said, oh, that's Panmure House. We own Adam Smith's house. We sort of ran out of ability to raise money or to whatever, and so it's effectively a watertight shell. And it was I would say it was more than a watertight shell. It was a watertight derelict shell.
On the second day that I was employed, my vice chancellor took me down to Panmure House, and we needed hard hats to go in, and we climbed through the rubble, and he said, I want you to bring this house back into the uses for which it was originally used, i.e. to bring the greatest minds together. It should have convening power, and I want it put back to use for the university, for Scotland, and for the world. And I thought, what a great vision, and it's going to be my absolute number one focus to get this sorted out. So my first 100 days at the business school, I ignored, I'm afraid, all the students and pretty well most of the staff, and spent my time on at least getting approval to finish the rebuild and find the funds to do that. So that took me 100 days. And then my big breakthrough came when I invited Dominic Barton to come and see the house, and he had to put a hard hat on and walk through rubble as well. And we looked at the house, and I showed him where Adam Smith had lived and worked, and I said, I really want to put this to use to bring people's minds on funding for the long term, because Heriot-Watt is full of innovative, cutting edge research. We are a technology based university in so many ways, and we've got the National Robotics Institute for the UK, and now, as I said earlier, we are the UK's leading industrial net zero centre, and yet people don't understand that all this technology is all very well, but if you don't have the capital to fund it over the long term, then it will never see the light of day. It will never advance the wealth of nations, to use an Adam Smith expression. And I knew that Dominic was passionate about this. I knew he'd been a founding member of FCLT, and then of course, Sarah, he introduced me to you, which was of course the second best thing he ever did. And then you kindly came to see the house together, and we came up with the idea of an academic prize, which I'm now thrilled that we have finally launched, so that we can get academics all over the world to put their minds on this, and that way we can do the very thing that Adam Smith himself did, which is bring some of the best minds to focus on some of the world's biggest problems.
Well, you're very kind. I will never forget putting on the hard hat and going into that place, and it really, your vision was very strong, but the current state of the building was it left a little to be desired at that point. So it's amazing to see it now, and it opened officially in the summer of 2019, and it is a wonderful convening place. Adam Smith would be proud. And now we've got this prize going. So did you want to update people on the prize and the committee that's been put together, and the call for papers that has gone out? Because this has really turned from, an idea into a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. The summer of 2019, we finally saw what extraordinary convening power we had at Panmure House when we held a New Enlightenment conference there. And many learned academics from all over the world joined us, Sarah, there, as you will remember. And I do remember at one point sitting in the room, would have been Adam Smith's front room when he lived there, and adding up the citations of the front row and realizing that we had 100,000 citations just along the front row of that room. I think Adam Smith would have been proud to have so many leading academic minds there from the finance and business world. And the prize was of course, it was an idea, and where we were very blessed was that Baillie Gifford, who themselves of course are funders of the long term and members of FCLT, have generously donated the money to run the prize for at least the first 5 years. And we've put out a call for papers for people to apply for $75,000 of research funding. So what that should mean, and we particularly, by the way, we want to encourage early career academics. We want people who want to be famous one day for working in the area of long-term investment. We want to find that next generation and to encourage that next generation of academics, because the more that this is written about, and the more that it's debated, the more likely it is to become a reality, and the more that people can prove that and you know, that with something that we already, of course, believe in, that investing for the long term is where the returns are, but we want to see more of that kind of work, and we want people to make it their lifelong area of study, if you like. So we're trying to encourage early career academics. We will give their institution $75,000. Hopefully that will give them some time off from teaching, or buy them some research assistants, or whatever they want to do with it. And then they'll be invited to come to Panmure House itself in the summer of 2022 to present their work. So we're calling for proposals. This is actually a call for a research proposal rather than for a paper. And the winner will get the money to spend time on developing their paper, which we will invite next summer. And if we get some really good applications, we'll probably, even if we don't fund the other work, we will still invite their authors back, and also encourage them to apply for the prize in future years. Because as I said, this isn't just a one-year event. We have assembled a really stellar judging panel, and again, I have to give full credit to FCLT, who worked so hard on this with me. It's been an amazing partnership. I feel incredibly grateful to you. We have, learned academics like Nitin Noria and David Teese, John Kay, and then we have people in other parts of the world. We have Adrian Orr, the governor of the Bank of New Zealand. We have people who've run or are still running enormous pension funds in Japan and in South Africa. We really have a great international group of people. And on top of all of that, of course, Sir Angus Deaton has agreed to be the patron of the prize, which I was absolutely thrilled about, and I hope you were too.
Absolutely thrilled. And maybe I can ask you to tell the story of Sir Angus Deaton and how he is associated with Heriot-Watt, because that is a very interesting story too.
Yeah, well, Sir Angus is an absolutely wonderful person who I have been privileged enough to spend quite a lot of time chatting to over Zoom over the last few months. And he told me that his father came to Heriot-Watt. His father was somebody who was born in Yorkshire and left school at 12, pretty illiterate. And this was a mining village. You were expected to basically leave school and go down the mines. And he was then conscripted into World War II. When he was invalided out in 1941, he moved to Edinburgh with Angus's mother. And they set about having their family, which is where Angus was born, and raising their family in Edinburgh. But his father went to work for an engineering company in George Street as some kind of office boy, an errand boy. But he went to night school at Heriot-Watt, and over the years, built himself all the way up to getting a degree in civil engineering eventually, which then led to him becoming, one day, he by the time he retired, he was the head of all water engineering for the south of Scotland. And Angus, of course, then grew up in a different level of expectation and academic achievement. And of course, Angus was incredibly clever. He ended up at a school in Edinburgh on a full scholarship, and then of course went to Cambridge. So but he is the first person to say that if his father hadn't gone to Heriot-Watt and hadn't raised their whole family's ambitions and expectations, it's entirely possible that Angus wouldn't have gone on to Cambridge. So I think that's very generous of him to acknowledge that role that Heriot-Watt played in his family. And of course, to this day, we are still the university in Scotland that looks after more people from what I would call widening access backgrounds than any other university.
And the story, I think, again, to make Adam Smith proud of having his legacy be tied to Heriot-Watt, which then, of course, educates Sir Angus's father, who then turns into be is brought up and turns into be a Nobel laureate in economics. I mean, there is just this wonderful chain there. And I think that, one of the things that you've said about the Panmure Prize is that hopefully there's a little bit of a chain, which is one person presents one year, and then the prize is awarded for the following, and then the following, and so on. And that we build this cadre of people who are really interested in this question of how do you fund long-term innovation? So to come back to what you were saying earlier on, where you have these sort of wild ideas that maybe we can decarbonize and really try to save our planet and do all sorts of fascinating technology, but doesn't quite have the funding that it needs for a 32-year project. That's how this is all going to come together, isn't it?
Yeah, and the circular economy is also all part of the net zero thing, and I like to think that this is the circular economy. It's interesting going back to the legacy of people, as opposed to the legacy of buildings, for instance. When I was fundraising for Panmure House, so after we got the money to actually do the physical infrastructure, then I was fundraising for the prize, for instance, and things like this. And even now, this year Heriot-Watt is 200, and I'm leading the fundraising for our widening participation scholarships. And one of our governors said, don't you want to put your energies into raising money for a building, rather than scholarships for people or academic prizes or whatever? And he said, what about the legacy of these things? And I said, actually, do you know what? Sir Angus, for instance, it's the most wonderful legacy, and not just him, but all the people he's ever taught, all the people who have ever read his work. What building could we have put up in the 1940s when his father went to Heriot-Watt? What building could we have put up then that would have had the same impact? Panmure House is a building, and it's a beautiful place to visit, and I would encourage anyone listening to this to get in touch if you'd like to come and see it. It's not open for the public, but we're always ready to share it with people. But ultimately, I think our legacy of this prize is going to be in people, and it's going to be in how many people can we get to put their minds to this. And then I think the legacy will be, at least 32, if not, multiples of 32 years.
Well, I think that, what this displays is obviously Adam Smith has led to long-term funding of innovation, but also long-term funding of people, of human capital. And that is what obviously academics do and universities do. But I think that our best hope for getting ourselves out of this climate issue and all sorts of other issues that we have today is going to be this next generation, who hopefully will both have the mindset and the ability to figure out some solutions here, and therefore we need to have the funding for them. So last question I'll ask you, which is, as you look forward, and we get this prize off the ground, you've done all sorts of things there at Heriot-Watt. What's next? What do you see? What's your next mountain to climb after you've done all of this amazing work in a relatively short time of being there?
Well, yes, I also, as well as Panmure House, we've had a completely new curriculum for the MBA and a new technology platform to offer it on. I'm privileged enough to run the most international MBA program in the world. To give you an example, I personally went to the London Business School, which graduates, a few hundred MBAs every year from all over the world. But at Heriot-Watt, we graduate 1,500 MBAs every year from literally all over the world. A third of my students are in sub-Saharan Africa. I have 100 students, for instance, right now in Myanmar, which is very challenging because they keep cutting off the internet there and after the coup. So I have students all over the world, and to be able to develop a whole new curriculum for them has been, as I said, a huge privilege, and again an investment in human capital. The chief medical officer in England, who is right now someone really in the headlights, did his MBA with us. The Prime Minister of Somalia did his MBA with us. So and that, by the way, that was as a refugee. And right now I raised the money to fund MBAs for refugees in camps in Lebanon and things like this. So that is all ongoing at the same time as Panmure House. From a personal point of view, though, I'm going to be 60 next year, as I said, and I've been here 5 years this year, so who knows what's next. I do know, though, that I want to stay working in long-term finance for a long time. I am currently completing all my examinations to become a qualified chartered accountant, which is something I never thought I would be doing at this stage in my life, but I'm 3 exams in and it's all looking good so far. And the next examination is on risk, Sarah, so that that will be very helpful. And of course I do have, as I said, several board directorships. And then the final thing I do is for the UK government is that I sit on the committee that awards honours. So the next time that we create a Sir out of an economics and Nobel laureate, it will be me who has helped to do that, because I'm one of the 6 people that gets to choose who in the world of business and economics is honoured by the Queen twice a year, which again, a very great privilege. So not shortage of things to do, Sarah. I'm sure I shall stay very busy.
No shortage of things to do at all, and a long list of contributions both to the university, the financial markets, to your country, and really also to FCLT. So we are so grateful for your partnership, for your leadership in terms of just your dynamism and your enthusiasm and setting up this prize and figuring out how to make this all happen, and just the impact that Heriot-Watt is having on the world. I think that you've sort of figured out distance education before anybody else did, at least in the financial business. And so the impact is enormous. So just thank you so much for your time today and for your focus on investing in the long run.
It's been a great pleasure, Sarah, and I'm very happy anytime to talk to people about going long. It is an absolutely critical decision that everybody needs to take, and we look forward to the prize supporting the debate.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Going Long with FCLT Global. Be sure to hit subscribe to get new episodes every other Monday. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org.